I'm extremely happy to introduce one of the foremost experts in welfare states across Europe. And we're very proud to have him here because also a member of our teaching staff. So this is a particularly, we're particularly proud to have Giuliano Bonoli from the University of Lausanne, which is also a member, as I said, of our faculty board. And Giuliano Bonoli, as I said, is a former, one of the most renowned experts in welfare states. I'm not going to summarize his work, but it's easy to check. Excellent work written on pension policies, skills. Probably you just told me about your interest in necessary skills. So there are quite a few subjects, quite a few areas that have been covered by Professor Bonoli. So I'm very happy to have him here to present his work, and I'm very happy to give him the floor. Thank you for being with us.
Oh. Thank you, Fabio, for this kind introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me to give this prestigious lecture. It's a great pleasure and a big honor to be able to do that. And we try to do my best in presenting some of the research we are doing in Lausanne. We have been doing in Lausanne over the last few years about the topic that is also the title of this presentation, Deservingness Perceptions in the Social Investment Welfare State. So I understand that this group contains both people who are familiar with the welfare state literature, and they have understood already what I'm going to talk about, and people who are not familiar with the welfare state literature, who probably haven't got a clue about what I'm going to talk about. But don't worry, everything will be explained so that it will be possible and hopefully easy to follow what I'm going to talk about. So let's start precisely by providing some definitions. And the first one is about the deservingness perceptions. Deservingness perceptions. So when we talk about deservingness perceptions in the context of the welfare state literature, we mean normative perceptions with regard to who should be helped, who should be helped by collective help. And it's something very intuitive, very easy to understand. If you ask someone, anyone, do you think the poor should be helped? Probably the answer you're going to get is yes, but, and this is what you're interested in, is the yes, but answer. So people are willing to help other people, humans in general are willing to help people who are undergoing some difficult situation like poverty, but not unconditionally. You want to help, we are available or willing to help people depending on the reasons why they are in need, depending on the efforts they're making to get out of the situation of need. So there are all sorts of conditions that are attributed to this. And that's what we call deservingness perception. So the study of who should be helped by the collective and how and under what conditions. So, and this is something that is very important in the study of social policy for a lot of reasons. One of them is that these deservingness perceptions have informed policy decisions since the early day of the welfare state. So if you look at the early days of social policies, the welfare state, some of the first groups that were deemed worthy of collective help protection are groups like widows, for example. So there is a very strong component of deservingness. Deserving poor widows or war veterans are among the first to have been covered by some kind of collective help. And this in a way reflects a perception of deservingness. These groups are considered deserving because of various reasons that we are going to explore in a moment. And they're also the first to have been supported collectively. And then other groups, typically able-bodied, so people with no disease, with no problems of working age, they're considered the least deserving. Often migrants are considered the least deserving. So there is we humans tend to make a kind of a hierarchy of who should be helped among all the people that are susceptible to need collective help. And this is what we talk about when we talk about deservingness perception. So Why are they important? I think they're important. Well, one reason is that they inform policy decisions, and this is very visible in the history of social policy. And also because they really speak to the intuition, to people, to very deeply seated values that people have, and they're easy to mobilize by political entrepreneurs. And this is something that we are witnessing, we've been witnessing over the last few years with the emergence, the strong emergence of right-wing populist parties that sort of defend a vision of the welfare state as something for us. There is this distinction between us and them that is made, us being the nationals, more or less, like members of a club. Some people who write within this strand of literature to talk about club membership. So we are willing to support us, but not them, something like this division. And this division is something that really speaks to many voters, as we know. And so that's another reason why these deservingness perceptions are important, because as you're going to see, they help to understand why it's so easy to win votes and support with this kind of divisive argument, because there is a basis on which this discourse can be applied. So what are deservingness perception? Now, hopefully you know, but you need to know also what social investment is, because these are the two components of the title. So in social policy, we talk about social investment to refer to a reorientation of social policies that had started in Europe maybe 20 years ago, and then it has accelerated more recently. And the idea here is that instead of simply handing out cash benefits, money, financial resources to poor people, to people who are in a difficult situation, the idea is to invest in their human capital. So as I put it on this slide, the idea of social investment is a strategy based on fighting disadvantage and inequality, which is the main objective of social policy, not so much through redistribution, which is the traditional way of doing things, but by investing in human capital for disadvantaged groups. It also aims to make social policy a productive factor. If you invest in people's human capital, you train them, you train the unemployed rather than just giving out a cash benefit. They're likely to find a new job faster and to contribute to the economy, and so to help preserve the current level of social rights. And of course, there is less emphasis on cash transfer and much more on services, the tools of the social investment welfare state. So this kind of welfare state that is being developed throughout Europe. Some countries are faster, some countries are slower in the movement, but it's kind of a general movement. There is less emphasis on cash transfer and much more on services. And the key policies, there are other ones, but just to make sure that we understand each other, are policies like childcare. Childcare is an investment in the human capital of the future workers who are children at the moment, but is also an investment that allows the human capital of the parents to be deployed. How many parents are not working or are not working as much as they would like because they don't have a childcare solution? So that's why childcare is considered as one of the big pillars of the social investment welfare state. And then you see other policy areas, active labor market policies. So this is policies that help unemployed people or jobless people who are on the welfare state to find a new job. They include things like job search assistance programs, subsidies paid to employers, and training also, training for the unemployed, which is a policy that will be picked up in a later moment in this presentation. And then inclusive education and training, lifelong learning. So this is the story of social investment. This story behind social investment idea is to invest in disadvantaged people's human capital, and in this way promote equality, promote inclusiveness, fight disadvantage in a way that is also productive. So you may believe or not this story, and it is a bit controversial, but that's not the point of today's presentation. This presentation is to study deservingness perceptions to this type of help. So I'm interested in knowing whether if you ask the general population about helping the people through these channels, something that they're willing to do, they're willing to do, they're willing to do, the condition attached to as we see is the case with general and the traditional social policies, the distributive social policies. So this is really the kind of endeavor that I would like to take you through today. And let's start by knowing a bit more what we know about deservingness perception. So there is a very long research tradition on this within the social policy community, but not only, also other groups of scholars have been interested in deservingness perceptions. And there are very stable results that come out of this research, the empirical research. Typically, disabled people, older people are preferred. So there is a hierarchy of deservingness. If you ask humans, I'm using the term of humans because it's sometimes used in the literature, but of course, it's maybe problematic because it's a literature that often talks about humans, but empirically studies at one extreme American undergrads. So it's a bit maybe an excessive generalization, but most studies are done in Europe, in the US, but not outside our culture. But anyway, humans are generally do this kind of categorization. Disabled people are considered among the most deserving because they're just unlucky, basically. It's not because of their fault if they're disabled. So we are willing to help them. Older people also. And then able-bodied adults, so people who are unemployed but have no physical impairment, we like a bit less helping these people. And usually immigrants are at the bottom of this deservingness hierarchy. And this is visible, as I said at the beginning, in the policies that have been developed, but also very visible in public attitude research. So as I said, there is a very large corpus of empirical research that shows pretty consistently that there are these hierarchies, that people differentiate among groups with regard to who should be helped by the collective. And one author who has been very influential in developing our knowledge on deservingness perception is a Dutch colleague, Wim van Oorschot, and he has developed this model called the Karin framework. It's very simple, but at the same time very effective in explaining what we see empirically. So basically it tells us there are 5 factors that explain our deservingness perceptions. The first one he calls control, and this whether the person in need has some control with regard to his or her situation of need. So typically a disabled people, someone who is born disabled, has no control over the situation of need. He or she is needed through no action of their own. Conversely, someone who is unemployed because he or she resigned his position, his previous job, because the commute was too long, say, is kind of responsible for being in a situation of need, so it has a lot of control on it. And this variable control can be, I gave you 2 extreme, can be located anywhere in this, on this dimension. Then the second one is attitude. Do people who are asking for help show gratitude, or do they sort of appear as entitled? Do they have an entitled attitude? And this is apparently also something that that impacts on our willingness to, of course, we are more willing to give to people, to give up some of our income for someone else if this person shows a gratitude. Reciprocity. Have these people who are asking for help contributed to society in the past, typically by paying taxes, typically by paying social insurance contributions or not? And this is kind of backward looking. Or are they willing to make an effort to end their situation of need? So typically for an unemployed person, is this person who is asking for help applying for jobs, or is this person watching daytime TV the whole day and waiting for a job to fall from the sky? These I think are things that I'm referring to here in the literature, but are very intuitive. I think everybody here, we can relate to this way of reasoning, I think. Then identity, and this is the one I would like to focus most of my presentation today, the rest of my presentation today. Identity is about, in most cases, ethnic identity. So it operationalized with migrants versus nationals. We could have called it cultural proximity, maybe in a more precise way, but identity is the term that is used in the literature. And so I will use it the same. So do they share the same identity? And we are more willing to help people who we perceive as similar. That's why I talked about cultural proximity. So Italians are more willing to help other Italians, Americans are more willing to help other Americans, and so on and so forth. And then the last one is need. Need is the situation of need real? Is the person really poor? The person who claims to be poor, is actually really poor and poor enough to sort of deserve? If someone typically has, I don't know, a Ferrari and asks for an employment benefit, maybe people would object to it. Whereas if the person has no car, then maybe the person, it's going to be more acceptable. So this is a framework developed in 2000, so more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but it's still very effective in explaining what we observe in terms of patterns of deservingness perceptions. Most studies find things that reflect pretty well what you have here. And that's kind of the standard view. And I said I wanted to focus on identity. And one thing that has been observed is that identity matters, and the way it matters is through an immigrant deservingness penalty. So this means that immigrants are considered as less deserving, and this penalty varies. If you look at the British example here, you can see that there is really a hierarchy in terms of deservingness scores by ethnicity. The farther away you move from the kind of English culture, let's say Irish is very close, and then Jamaican and Pakistani, it declines. And this is just one example of a very large literature. I could have taken tens of graphs that resemble all this one. In our own research, which I will present in a moment, we also find a very strong immigrant penalty, immigrant deservingness penalty. So it's something that is really well established in the literature, that when you ask whether people are deserving of collective help, the respondents tend to penalize migrants, often with a hierarchy that reflects cultural proximity. So migrants who come from a nearby country are considered a bit more deserving, and migrants that come from faraway countries are considered as less deserving. So you may wonder, where do these perceptions come from? And there are two theories around that are pretty incompatible one another, and there is a controversy between, among other, these two authors. Wim van Oorschot was the guy who did the Karin framework I presented just before, and then another group that sort of turns around a Danish political scientist, Michael Bang Petersen. What do they say? So the first, Wim van Oorschot believes that these perceptions are simply attitudes, and they are developed through socialization. It's the same reason why some people are socialized into more left-wing values or right-wing values. And basically, depending on what you are exposed to in your family, in your school, in your environment, you develop a deservingness perception that goes in one direction or the other. Michael Bang Petersen has a much more, what can I say, profound and ambitious but also controversial explanation for this. He talks about humans. He believes that to understand why we have these normative perceptions, we have to go back to a time when we humans were living in small groups and living from hunting and things like this. And at the time, we had to live in small groups. Alone, we would not survive. Human would not survive. And we could not tolerate free riders, basically. Small groups cannot tolerate free riders. And groups, through an evolutionary psychology mechanism, developed this quality, which is a strong dislike for free riders, basically. So if someone didn't participate to the hunt, but then wanted to eat the food that this was not okay, so it was kind of pushed away from the group. And groups, through an evolutionary psychology mechanism, groups that practice this exclusion of free riders were more successful and remained, and groups that were generous and accepted everyone and shared their food with everyone, they sort of declined. And we are all the children and grandchildren of those who who did not share with the free riders. So that's the evolutionary psychology story, which maybe you find convincing, maybe not. It's true that it's difficult to test. Michael Bank-Pedersen tests it or claims can test it by comparing these attitudes that you just saw, for example, between Denmark and the US. So two countries with very different welfare states, and finds very similar patterns. And so this is the conclusion. This is about humans. In reality, it's not really humans because it's Danes and Americans that are compared. So it would be nice to do this kind of analysis in some kind of tribe that has never been exposed to Western culture. And this hasn't happened as far as I know. But let's stay where we can on the basis of the available literature. And what's important, I think, that in the second perspective, deservingness perception have a function which is to protect groups from free riders. So there is a kind of a rational element behind this. It's good to protect groups from free riders. I mean, now we have big groups have got much bigger. We can afford free riders probably, but it has remained this kind of attitude, dislike for free riders. So they have a function. And this is important when we think of the policies, because if we can think of policies that are free rider proof, then we should not expect this kind of deservingness perceptions to be so important. If you have a policy where you cannot really free ride because of the nature of the policy, then these factors should not matter so much. I will come back to this in just kind of preparing the field. So that's why I'm saying that there are different policy implications depending on which of the two stories you believe. So that's the time to bring back social investment now. The research that has been used so far to study deservingness perception uses traditional social policies like typically unemployment benefit or social assistance, income support. So it's really cash transfers that are used. When Michael Bank-Pedersen asks the Danes and the Americans who should be helped, he means who should be helped with an unemployment benefit, for example, with a social assistance benefit. So cash transfers. And in cash transfers, it's relatively easy to cheat the system, to be a free rider. If you think of social assistance, it's meant for people who don't have a job. Someone could have a job and not declare it and get social assistance. They're meant for people who don't have a job but are making efforts to sort of find one. You could say, I'm looking actively for a job but not really be doing this. So it's relatively easy to cheat the system, to free ride on a social assistance scheme. No? But when we think of social investment, remember what I said at the beginning about social investment. We're talking about support in a very different form. So we're not talking about cash, we're talking about childcare. How can you free ride on childcare? It's kind of more difficult. You need to have a child, the child needs to be brought to the childcare center. So if you receive subsidized childcare, it's maybe not impossible. One can conceive ways in which free riding maybe happens there, but let's not play too much the fantasy game. I think it's pretty difficult to imagine how you can free ride on a childcare program. Or we said that active labor market policy, things like training for unemployed people. Here too, how can you free ride on that? You're unemployed, the state pays you a training program that increases your chances of getting a job. You have to show up if you want to profit from it. If you don't show up because you have another job, well, you're not going to receive the benefit, the service that is being paid for. So it's more difficult, I think, objectively to cheat the system, to free ride when we think of social investment intervention. And it's also much more difficult for political entrepreneurs who want to exploit these divisions that we saw at the beginning, something which happens. It's more difficult to portray migrants, for example, groups in general, but particularly migrants as free riders and childcare and paying for their employed. And so we would expect maybe these normative perceptions to play out differently. And particularly because we are interested in this, strongly also in relation to the current situation and what these right-wing populist parties are sort of proposing. particularly the identity criterion. So put in another way, in simpler terms, are migrants, we saw that there is an immigrant penalty for cash benefits, very strong, consistent. Is there a similar immigrant penalty for this? If you ask people, should immigrants receive subsidized childcare, for example, are they going to penalize the immigrants as they are doing for social assistance and unemployment insurance, or are things going to be different? This is something we explore in these two papers that have come out this year and last year. And more specifically, we ask 3 questions. The first one is the one I just said. So is there a different impact of identity? Is there, more precisely, a lower immigrant penalty for social investment intervention, or maybe no penalty for social investment intervention? And then we go a bit farther. We also ask if maybe it applies to some subgroups only, because it requires a bit of reasoning, this, and maybe not everybody reasons in the same way. So we look for heterogeneous effects. We first look in general if there is a difference in terms of immigrant penalty between social investment and social transfer, traditional social policies. Then we do an analysis by subgroups. And then we also try to see if there are differences across countries. Again, welfare states are different, kind of embody different values. It could be possible that what we expect to happen happens somewhere, but not everywhere. So these are the 3 questions we want to study, to answer, and we did this with a vignette study. I don't know if people are familiar here with this methodology, which is becoming more and more common over the last few years. So a vignette experiment. And basically, in this case, a vignette, it's a short story which describes a situation of need of a person. And then respondents are asked to set a priority with which this person should receive collective help on a scale from 0 to 100. And we did this vignette experiment in 6 countries: Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, Germany, the UK, and the US. And yes, respondents had to rate the level of deservingness of different fictional situations, where we varied several dimensions. So there is a software that produces random combinations of the dimensions of interest. For example, nationality, age, occupation, gender, the effort that is made to find a new job, for example, for those who are unemployed, and so on and so forth. And by mixing up all these dimensions, it's very difficult for the respondent to know what we are going to compare the responses upon. So it's easier to get politically, to get beyond political correctness, for example, or socially desirable answer. This is something that has been demonstrated in the methodological literature. And we have 3 vignettes. So the first one is deservingness to unemployment benefits. So this is not social investment, it's our benchmark in a way. So to have something to compare to deservingness to social investment interventions, we also did a vignette where the situation described is of an unemployed and how deserving this person is of unemployment benefits, so the cash benefit, the traditional welfare state. And this is not something new. This has been done several times, but we use it as a benchmark against which we compare the other 2. And the other 2, you see, it's training, active labor market policy for an unemployed person. So this is typical social investment. And the third one is a subsidized childcare slot. Of course, subsidized is very important because we are talking about collective help. And if a childcare slot is not subsidized, there is no collective help involved. So the word subsidized, which I didn't use before, but it's very important. It's exactly very important. This is an example of a vignette that our respondents saw. So that's for the unemployment experiment. I don't know if you can read. Yes, maybe you can read the text. So the text. So you see there is a lot of information. The person, the fictitious person, is a 25-year-old man who has resigned from his job as a cleaner because of excessive overtime. He's a Ukrainian citizen. We did the study before the Russian aggression, so no intention to model this. Ukrainian citizen who has lived in the US for 5 years. He has contributed to unemployment insurance for the past 4 years, is currently looking for a job and manages to send out 1 to 2 applications per week. He could live up to 3 months on his savings. So maybe I didn't kind of highlight what changes in these descriptions, but you can connect to this discussion before. You have the nationality that changes, of course. You have the number of applications that are sent out that changes, and all these kind of things. And that's how we measure a deservingness perception, by comparing the rating on a scale from 0 to 100 that people give to these different fictitious situations. Here you have the example of the childcare vignette. So this is a single mother has applied for childcare place and is waiting to hear back. She's an American citizen who was born in the US and has lived there all her life. Financially, she and her family more or less manage on their current income. She worked as a food engineer and has paid taxes for the past 8 years, but is currently unemployed and looking for a job. And these are both in the US, but because we took the US version of the questionnaire, the other ones are in other languages. So it was easier to take the US version. But of course, this has been done similarly in all the countries we cover. And here too, there are things that change, that vary. So here she's an American citizen, but she could be Ukrainian or other nationalities. And she's unemployed. In some other cases, she has a job, she has a partner. So there are all sorts of combinations. I won't enter too much into the detail because it's kind of complex. But what's important, I think, is to understand a little bit the mechanism, the mechanics of this methodology. And I'm going to show you some examples of results, but first the dimension of interest. So I'm not going to focus on all the dimensions because this would require too much time, but I would suggest that we focus on nationality. And so for each country, we have a national, an American for the study in the US, a British for the study in the UK, a Swiss for the study in Switzerland, and so on and so forth. Then a national from a nearby country. So for example, for the US, it was a Canadian. For the Swiss, it was a German or a French. For the German, it was an Austrian. For the Brits, it was an Irish. So we wanted to have a close, culturally close profile. Then the other 3 countries are the same throughout the sample, and we picked nationalities that were more or less represented in all the countries. That's the motivation for the choice, but also with a kind of a gradient in terms of cultural distance. So Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. So this is the nationalities we are interested in. And now I'm going to show you an example of results. It's just an example because, we have 3 policies times 6 countries. You have to think of 18 graphs like this one, and maybe you don't want to, you're going to get bored if I show you 18 graphs like this one. So I showed only one and then some summary results. But I show one so that you get an idea of what comes out from these studies. In red, I've circled the part that I'm most interested now, which is the impact of nationality. And as you can see, and as expected, there is a penalty. There is an immigrant penalty here. Right? You can see that there is an immigrant penalty. So basically, if you are to the right of the vertical axis, the characteristics is associated with more deservingness. If you are to the left, less deservingness. And as you can see here, the Swedish parents are considered the most deserving. The second one is the Norwegian. It's basically the same. But then those who come from farther away, they are considered as less deserving of a childcare place. So we already have the beginning of the answer to our question. Is social investment different? What does this tell us? To the answer, is social investment different? Not really, eh? But let's wait before we jump to conclusions. But here, the impression is that social investment is not different. It's exactly the same pattern that we saw, for example, in the graph I showed before of the immigrant penalty relative to unemployment insurance benefit. Maybe we can point out some other effects that are visible on this slide. We have financial status, for example. So the parents were described in some experimental conditions as comfortable, and you see that this is the biggest penalty. So there is a rich penalty, rich family penalty. People are willing to subsidize childcare for families who are not so rich, but not so willing for those who are richer. And also for parents who are not working, as you can see. And these penalties are actually bigger than the migrant penalty. Yeah? Basically finds that both factors matter in a cumulative way. So yeah, the more you are from far away, either in terms of nationality or place of birth, length of stay, the less deserving you are. And so this is, again, is just an example of results. And I won't show you 18 graphs like this one, but I will show you one that summarizes the effect on the migrant penalty. And now you know what I'm talking about when I'm saying immigrant penalty. And here you have the immigrant deservingness penalty across countries and policies. So maybe it takes a bit of time to understand how to read this graph. You have the countries, of course, and then for each country, you have the three policies we are interested in: unemployment benefit, which is in the middle, which is our benchmark, which where we find a migrant penalty. And by the way, here we put together all the foreign nationalities. So to simplify, instead of having 4 different nationalities, we put them all together under foreigner. And that's what you see. That's the penalty for the foreign relative to the national. It's the coefficient of foreigner relative to the national, this penalty. And so the one in the middle, UB, is an employment benefit. It's our benchmark. And we find what everybody else has found when they studied unemployment benefit deservingness perception, so that there is an immigrant penalty. It's maybe something that comes out here is that it's a bit bigger in Denmark than in the other countries. And this is consistent with other findings that come out from this survey, and maybe also the perception that we have of Denmark and the position of the Danish voters in relation to the inclusion of immigrants in the country, but otherwise there are no big differences. And then you have the immigrant penalties. So everywhere, right? You see that the difference, the coefficients are always negative and always different from 0. So immigrant penalties exist everywhere for in terms of countries and in terms of policies. And we would have expected the immigrant penalty to be much lower or inexistent for ALMP, which is training the unemployed, and childcare, but this is not something that we find. So the first question, is social investment different in terms of deservingness perception? The answer seems to be no. But again, let's not jump to conclusion too fast, because we expected yes. So we looked a bit more. Yeah. Matteo, you have a question? Yeah. If anything, yes, the differences are not significant in general, but for sure it's not the case that they are less exposed to the immigrant bias. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. On this level, no. Later on, there will be some institutional difference in coming up. But no, that's, I think you understood well what comes out. So this was a bit of a disappointment because we had invested a lot in this study, as you can imagine, and we were hoping to be able to tell the world, you should do social investment if you want a welfare state that is compatible with a multicultural society. But that's science. Sometimes when you do science, you have to learn to accept criticism, as you said before, and also to learn to accept that results don't tell you what you want to hear. And that's it, basically. But we don't give up so easily. So we did some additional analysis, heterogeneous effects. It could be possible that this effect that we assumed does not happen across the board, but only among some subgroups, because it requires a bit of thinking. Maybe you have to sort of distinguish between giving money to someone who is just sitting at home relative to giving money to someone who works and takes. And so maybe it requires a bit of analytical skills. And so we wanted to study this in relation to education. The hypothesis being maybe this effect is visible only for higher education, for people with higher education. And then the second one, maybe you need to believe a little bit in the social investment promise, which is you invest in people and then these people will be autonomous. And if you don't believe in the social investment promise, maybe you just don't want to spend money on people. And so we have another question in the survey, which is what is the primary purpose of the welfare state? And one possible answer was to support people to get better education and new jobs. And that's, we call this as an indication of support for social investment. And so the hypothesis here is that the effect will only be visible in groups that believe in the welfare state, in the social investment story, kind of. And we did this extra analysis, but in relation to education, there is no difference whatsoever. And the social investors, so those who said yes to the idea that the purpose of the welfare state is social investment, are less likely to penalize immigrants, but regardless of the policy field. So it's not really a confirmation of our expectation. This is the result in relation to the social investors. So there are those on the right of each panel. Each panel is one of the three policy areas, and those on the right are the social investors. And you see that there is no migrant penalty, but it's a bit different from what we expected. We expected the policy to matter, and here it's not. The policy doesn't matter because there is no difference between unemployment benefit and ALMP or childcare. Regardless of the policy, social investors don't penalize migrants. So it's not so much social investment in the policy that seems to matter. It doesn't matter. It's social investment in the mind of people that matters. But to be really honest, this is just a question of values. And if I had taken, instead of social investment, I had taken left-right positioning, I would have found the same result. So we cannot claim that social investment sort of as another route to make helping migrants more acceptable, because it's just a matter of value here, what we see. So let's move now to cross-national variations and see if the differences that exist in European welfare states matter, and not only because we have the US, matter with regard to these findings. And we rely on recent work by three colleagues, Julian Garritzman, Silja Heusermann, and Bruno Pallier, who have studied social investment worldwide, and they have come up with a typology or a distinction between three types of social investment, which for those of you who know the welfare state literature are not really surprising, because they reflect very precisely the typology of welfare states that we've used since 1990. But anyway, I think it's still interesting the way in which these are justified. They distinguish, they say more or less that everybody, most countries in the world are developing social investment policies, but in a different way. And they identify three different distributional profile. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this, because then we are going to look for these distributional profiles in the responses that people gave to our survey. And the first one is what they call inclusive. I would have called it universal social investment. It means that everybody is targeted. So there are no division, distinction. Childcare is for everyone. Training is for everyone. Lifelong learning is for everyone. That's the Nordic way of doing social investment. It's the Swedish way of doing social investment. Every child has a guaranteed place in a childcare center, and the parents have to pay relatively very little, in fact, in comparison to other countries. So social investment is for everyone there. Then you have the stratified version, which is what you find in continental Europe. And I think they have in mind, especially Germany here. And the stratified version is a social investment effort that is targeted on the middle of the income distribution, on the middle classes. Why the middle classes? Because that's, in one view, it's the investment that can be most productive. Typically, women, highly educated women, or at least mid-educated women, who are not working because of a childcare problem, that's a problem for the economy. So we want to allow these women to enter into the labor market, and to create childcare places, but not for everyone, because we don't care about the migrants, we don't care about the higher income people, we care about those who are renouncing working. And for example, if you look at the coalitions that are behind social investment reforms in these countries, is often a coalition between the social democrats and employers. Employers are in favor because there is a return on investment, which is very clear for them. Also, active labor market policy is not necessarily targeted on those who are most distant from the labor market. It's more targeted on people who are closer to the labor market, in a way that they quite stratified because it sort of reproduces social inequalities. Middle classes got more, the poor were excluded from the labor market get less. And, uh, and maybe there is also another motive, which is the back to this motive. You want to bring the labor market those who are able to generate more revenue. And those who are at the distant, the cost benefit ratio of the interventions are very low. Then you have the targeted version that you find in UK and the US in the liberal welfare state. And here social investment is really only for the poor, targeted, and often is seen as a means to get the poor off the welfare state. So typically in the US, if you are on the equivalent, the American equivalent of social assistance, you will get free childcare. You will not for the state to free childcare for you, but not out of a vision of promotion of child development and welfare and everything. The country is still allowed to work, so you have not social assistance anymore. And in the UK, it's kind of similar. So here, social investment is targeted on the poorest and is part of a strategy to diminish the cost of the welfare state, the cost of cash benefits, increase the autonomy of people around the welfare state, the financial autonomy to diminish the costs. So three different distributional profile that have different targets in terms of groups that are targeted, inclusive in the Nordic country, everyone, regardless of the rich and the poor alike, stratified mostly the middle classes and certainly not the poorest, and targeted the poorest. So this is what they tell us. They do institutional analysis. They don't look at public opinion at all, these guys here. And we wanted to see if this helps explain the variation that we observe in relation to our public opinion study. So if you look at cross-national variation now in our study with the various vignettes, we find no differences in unemployment benefit or ALMPs. Basically, the kind of graph you saw once, and I told you that there are 18 of these graphs we can do. The ones that concern, so the 12 that concerns unemployment benefit and ILMP, so training for the unemployed, are virtually photocopies of one another. There is no systematic visible difference, which is kind of striking for comparativists, because comparatives tend to believe that institutions matter. And some of us yesterday attended another presentation where the result was also in this direction. But in childcare, we find some institution-related patterns. And what are they, these institution-related patterns? This you see the coefficient for unemployed. So the various vignette persons sometimes have a job, sometimes are unemployed when they look for a childcare place. And as you can see, the coefficient for unemployed is sometimes negative and sometimes positive. Basically, it is negative in the Nordic countries and in the continental European countries, but positive in the UK and in the US. And the fact that it is positive in the UK and the US is perfectly compatible with the view of social investment being targeted on the poorest, so on the unemployed, especially also with a view to get them off unemployment. And then you see that Germany and Switzerland, the two conservative welfare states, have the highest penalty for the unemployed, which is what was to be expected. Now, this is not related to migrants. So this is unemployment in Germany. Yeah. It's unemployment, sorry, it's an unemployed parent versus a parent who has a job, basically. Working full time, yes. That's because we also had one who was working part-time. And yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, to get out of unemployment. Yeah. So this is an hypothesis. I mean, we don't know why they answer in this way. It's my hypothesis that that's the reason, because they see, but but it's compatible with the kind of institutional vision that these colleagues presented before, and with these results that you see in the UK and in the US, that the unemployed should be favored relative. So they're more deserving of a childcare slot relative to full-time workers, the unemployed, but only in these two countries, not in the other ones. In Switzerland and in Germany. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Possibly, yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. This is really about childcare for unemployed people. So whether people would like to subsidize childcare for unemployed people or not. And you see that there are country differences in relation to this question. Emanuele? It's not significant. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But they're really, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But if you take Sweden, for example, it's not only for working parents. Unemployed parents are allowed in Sweden, and there was a change in legislation a long time ago, which really made it clear that unemployed parents are also allowed to have access to subsidized childcare. But is that this does not filter into the, yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly, yeah, yes, exactly. So what is a, so the fact that Switzerland and Germany are much lower, this is not a surprise, is what we would have expected on the basis of the Pallier-Heusermann et al. Model, but we would have expected no effect. If it is universal, and nothing should be significant in the Nordic countries in a way, no? Because everybody has entitlement. It's a little bit as if, like in Italy, I ask if a child deserves to go to school for free. I don't know, people would find strange. School is free for everyone. It's not really, and we would have expected this to be the case in Sweden for childcare. But in some Swedish colleagues told us this, be careful because maybe you find nothing, because in Sweden it's just normal that people have access to subsidized childcare, but that's not what we find. And you're right, we were surprised to find that an effect in Denmark and Sweden is very similar to Germany and Switzerland. And then the other difference that we find, which is also compatible with the Pallier-Heusermann-Garritzmann story, is the rich penalty. So rich parents are penalized everywhere. This is not surprising. I mean, it's about need. It's one of the criteria identified by Wim van Oorschot as criteria that matter. So we find something that is really to be expected, that rich parents are penalized everywhere. But you see that the penalty is biggest in the UK and in the US, which is consistent with the view that social investment is for the poor. So certainly not for those who are financially comfortable. And we would have expected this to be lowest in the Nordic countries. And we have one Nordic country at least that is in the right place, Denmark. And then Sweden is a bit lower, and we would have expected also Switzerland and Germany maybe to be a bit higher, but I think overall this pattern is quite compatible with the expectations that you would develop on the basis of the institutional analysis done by Pallier and colleagues. So we do find some cross-national variation, limited, that's about it. There is maybe another small effect which I'm not presenting, but is even smaller than the ones I'm presenting now. So that's about it. So in a way, we confirm also previous results that these deservingness perceptions tend to be very similar across countries, but not completely. There is some institutional effects here, but not in the other ones. This is interesting, and we don't really know why we find an effect of institutions in childcare and not in unemployment insurance or active labor market policies. Maybe there is, since it's a newer policy, there is more difference in the way this policy is developed. And I'd be happy to hear if people have some hypotheses with regard to this. So if we now try to conclude, go back to our initial question, is social investment different? No, there is really no evidence of a different way to develop deservingness perceptions when we talk about social investment relative to social consumptions of social transfer policies, which is a bit surprising maybe from the theoretical point of view, but I think the result is very robust because we really tortured the data to try to find the effect, and it's really not there, I think, in this data at least. So the result is very robust, and they showed you a little bit of the extra analysis we did before giving up on the hypothesis. In my view, there is also little evidence that responses are driven by a desire to protect collective arrangements from free riders, because this is the Michael Bank-Pedersen story. If this were the case, we would have found a difference, I believe, between social investment and social consumption, social transfer. Since we don't find it, it's not really convincing to me, the story that these perceptions have a function which is to protect collective arrangements from free riders. Doesn't seem to be what comes out from our data. And the drivers seem to be two different drivers. One is dislike of certain groups. We dislike foreigners, basically, and that's the certain group is immigrants, foreigners. So it's a simple dislike. Whatever they do, we don't want to support them. Some of us, at least, maybe because there is a big left-right gradient in this story. So these effects are driven by right-of-center respondents mostly. But some of us, at least, don't like foreigners and don't want to support them. And institutions do matter a little bit. And the respondents attributed priority in a way that is consistent with the ethos of the institution, with the kind of objective of the social investment policy that is in place in the country. And of course, this raises the question, which is going to be my conclusion. I will conclude on a question. This maybe is not so usual, but I think it's something that remains open, is what does it mean for social investment in the social policy literature, in the welfare state studies literature? Not everyone, but there is a sizable group of scholars who supports social investment as a way to deal with the challenges that we are facing. What does this mean for social investment? Does it mean that maybe it's not such a good idea in the multicultural societies that are developing? Does it mean that we have to explain better what social investment is to the public? We didn't explain much to our respondents. We just show them the vignettes, and some critique we got by social investment advocates was, you should explain better what social investment is about. But then it becomes a treatment. It becomes you intentionally create some kind of bias. I don't know, but maybe this could be the subject of future research. And so for now, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for your presentations, because your presentations, I think, epitomize what I said about the breadth and the depth and rigor of doing research, because it is a contribution that overlaps a lot of the fields that we covered earlier on, because it is about comparative welfare states, comparative institutions, even null fundings are useful, but it's also about public opinion, and it is about empirical, it is about experimental political science, which we didn't even talk about, but it actually covered all these topics. And this is really, it is not something that we expect students necessarily to reach this level at the end of the PhD, but that is where you should strive for in the long term, okay? So I would like to thank you very much for your presentations, and I would like to open, if we have a little bit of time, to open to a couple of questions, if you're available, for a couple of questions from the audience, if you want to have any queries, especially from the students, but also from colleagues, of course, which have already intervened in the debate. Comments? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Was very, very good to hear, and also with to see how the result of a vignette experiment was done. I have a question that I sign when you talk about the Bank Petersen theory, so the evolutionary psychology, and also for your conclusion, which come to my mind that if I want nowadays to avoid free riders, I mean those who are not paying taxes and not only for that reason, and so they do not contribute to the system. And if I remember correctly from the graph, it was signed by the reciprocity variable, I think. It was one of the few also variable that has a positive coefficient. So my question is, have you tried to test if the evolutionary psychology theory, let's say, was founded an interaction between identity and reciprocity? And if so, what have you found? Thanks.
Good at, but I'm not. No, it's not a question. It's providing some food for thought for Giuliano on his question. You have suggestions why we see differences between childcare and the other two policies. Well, my answer would be that the other two policies you consider are employment-related risks policies, which are really focused on specific groups in society. So the likelihood of becoming unemployed is not the same. Well, perhaps, of course, it depends on the labor market. You got a lot of different labor markets, but on average is on the bottom or medium bottom part of so it's more about outsiders or weak groups. Whereas childcare is typically a life cycle social risk. So it's something that usually a lot of people, no matter their social class and their condition on the labor market, will find themselves. So in a way, when you ask these things, you're asking people, apart from the specific policy, really to look at two different types of risks. One is employment-related, highly target on certain groups. The other is everybody. So that might explain why you find something on childcare and not on active labor market policies and benefits.
Yes, I have, three observations. The first one is just methodological curiosity. When you show us the vignette, there was a sequence in the description of the different dimensions. So, for instance, if I remember correctly, mother, then something else, then on the hand, the nationality and so on. Did you try to change the sequence in the discussion, because the sequence can affect also the impression that the respondent can have? So, I mean, the way how you started the description can make a difference. This is the first issue. The second one is somehow associated maybe with his question, is the issue of the free riders. I mean, let me say that I'm not an expert in your literature, but I know, for instance, quite well the Commons and the Einhorstern approach. And we know very well that one of the crucial design principle in order to allow the cooperation is that there are clear boundaries of the common pool resources and also a clear definition of who are the providers and who are the consumers and so on. And so the fact that there is somehow, hostility against the foreigners depends on the fact that they can be perceived as predatory with a very short time horizon compared to the natives, to the people living there. So a crucial question is, did you try to define a different period of state of the foreigner in order to check if they are more or less considered predatory? Because obviously, if the foreign people are considered people living there for quite a long time, okay, they maybe can be considered less predatory, and maybe and third one is the problem of how much these policies are paid through fiscal instead of contribution. And as I told you, I'm not an expert, but I remember that I attended some presentation about the difference between, for instance, pension policies and health policies. I mean, in most of the countries, in the Central European countries, the pension policies are paid directly through the contributions. So even if you are an immigrant, in order to have the pension, you have to be contribute. On the contrary, the health, I mean, the fact that you can go to the hospital is paid by the entire collectivity instead of the contribution. And so it seems that in the public opinion, there are much more hostile attitudes with the immigrants when they take advantage of the health system compared to the pension policies. And so these type of aspects, the demand side aspects, is it considered or not, doesn't make any difference.
Very quickly, thank you very much, Giuliano. Really, really illuminating in many different ways. I have to say, and I'm sorry for you, but I'm a little bit relieved by many of your results. I know that you might not agree. I mean, I'm sorry for you, but you were able to publish it very well, so that's great for you in any case. But my question mainly relate to the role of ideology, because I always had the struggle a bit with the current model. And but you mentioned at the end that these kind of preferences were also driven by institutional dynamics, but you also, at a certain point, you also said that ideology mattered, and I wanted to, but you did not show in your graphs, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more. And the second reason is because at the beginning, you actually theorized that the difference between social investment and social and cash benefit should allow for a better perception of deservingness related to the people. At the same time, I know that's a very old discussion that we have continued to have, but I continue to see a lot of complementarities between these two domains. And I mean, social investment scholars always try to stress that cash benefits are part of social investment. So, I mean, also on that front, I can, and I totally agree with the point that was made before by Emanuele. I can see that on policy, the real differences could be between universal or life-related risk, such as childcare, and those that are more related to redistribution or labor market-related risk. But I can totally follow the reasoning. Whereas I'm not so sure that as the real issue, the difference between the difference between cash transfers and the social service and the investment.
There is Stefano Bonchi online that he raises his hand, but I don't know how to unmute you. I don't know whether you can unmute yourself so that you can intervene. You can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay, very good. Okay, go ahead.
I yet to do it myself. So thanks very much, Giuliano. I really like the paper. I think it's a very nice way to bridge between the Van Horscott deservingness literature and the social investment and welfare state change one. So I would have many comments, but I'll focus my only on one of these comments that regards occupational status and childcare. So to begin with, first you showed a graph on Sweden while we were actually commenting on the immigrant background side, so identity side of the results. But in that same slide, what I noticed first, but that's perhaps my bias, Matthew effect bias, was the perfect Matthew effect-like gradient of the coefficient for occupational status. I explain myself. Basically, the pattern of the coefficients was exactly reflecting the Matthew effect, that is to say, those who are already better placed in the labor market, the better off gets more and are supposed to be deserving more, also in the view of public opinion, while those who are out of work should not, I go very fast now, so in a way should not get a place, is it this one? Yes, those who are not working should not get a childcare, subsidized childcare slot. On the one hand, this reflects the, in a way, perverse policy design in many countries. I know that Italy is not in your sample, but I know well the case of Italy. So in many municipalities, in order to get a public place in a kindergarten, basically one of the criteria is whether both parents work. If they don't, it's quite likely you are left out of the place in a public creche more than kindergarten. On the one hand, it reflects policy design. On the other, that's a novelty you are showing to my knowledge for the first time. It reflects also the public opinion, at least in Sweden, Germany, in Nordic and continental countries. Then you showed also the results in respect to this, comparing the countries in your sample, and UK and US stood out. So to me, and that's my hunch, my guess, this has to do with not with policy design, but what we generally call policy mix. My hunch would be, well, in liberal welfare states, so lean welfare states, people are used to see what they have around them. That is to say, those who can afford good private childcare buy that from the market, so rely on the market in order to have childcare, while only the poor people, so possibly the unemployed, are entitled or can access, or in the eyes of the common people, so to speak, should be granted a place in a perhaps lower quality public childcare facility. While this is not the case, for sure not the case in universalistic inclusive, if I remember Garis Manetal categorization models, and not even in continental Bismarckian models. I mean, that would be my interpretation. I would say that this was to my eyes at least, the most important and novel, in a way, finding that you could front load in the paper. I mean, to me, it's a very nice and needed contribution. It's not good news, but it tells a lot, and it gives a lot of food for thoughts also for future research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have enough questions for you, which is always a very good sign. So of course, it's a sign of interest. I let you answer whatever you like to any of those comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for these very interesting questions and ideas that make a lot of sense and will allow us to bring forward our analysis. Maybe if I take them in the order they were raised. So first about, you asked about the evolutionary psychology and whether we can sort of test it by interacting with taxes and the fact of having paid taxes. We did these interactions, but there was nothing that came out worth interpreting. But more generally, I think it's really difficult to test this evolutionary psychology hypothesis. I think, but I'm not capable of doing this. We would need to collaborate with anthropologists or ethnologists. So to study societies that have not been influenced by Western culture and see if this kind of dislike of the free rider is as developed as it is here. Here it is quite consistently coming out, I would say. Then Emanuele will skip, wait for him to come back. And then sequencing the vignette, I think in this particular case, we did not randomize it. In other studies, we did randomize, but here not. So you're right, there might be an issue of salience that the first items get most attention. But looking at the significance of the coefficients, this doesn't really seem to have been a big problem. And then, yes, you mentioned the literature on collective goods, Elinor Ostrom and so on. And it's later, I don't know so well, I mean, I know a little bit because she's very famous. But of course, there are parallels, I think. And what you said about the migrants, and there are further developments of this literature I'm referring to, where they use the notion of a club, for example, because the idea is really that it's not maybe migrant per se, because migrants who have stayed a long time in the country, this we also see in our data, are a bit more deserving than those who just arrived. And then there is another study where they use, it's an American study, they use some items that sort of indicate Americanness, like, I don't know, someone who has an American flag in the garden or something like this. And this seems to matter as well. And so the colleagues who have done this kind of analysis, they talk about the club. So basically, we are happy to help those who are members of our club. And it's kind of an exclusive club. You don't get in very easily in our club. In the US, is also serving in the US Army. If you have been born abroad, but you've served in the US Army, your deservingness goes up a lot. So having done something where you took a risk for the collective, this is very highly valued. So, and I think this effect, the identity effect, is something that we are beginning to understand. Maybe the other ones are more intuitive because they're about protecting groups from free riders, but this identity effect is a bit more complicated too. And the distinction between fiscal versus social contribution is also important, because fiscal contribution implies reciprocity. So if you didn't pay, you don't get, so there is no problem. But, and we would expect this to matter, but for example, unemployment insurance is different in the countries that we covered. In the UK is very little the contributory part of unemployment insurance. Most of it is tax finance. In Germany is very contributory, but the results are very similar in the two countries. So this is not something that comes through the data. Marcello, ideology matters. Yes, this is something that we wanted to further investigate, but haven't been able so far. But these are average effects. And if you look at a simple predictor, which is positioning on the left-right axis, most of what you saw in terms of migrant penalty is driven by right-of-center voters. Left-of-center voters, with the exception of Denmark. In Denmark, everybody sort of applies this penalty, but in all the other countries, it's right-of-center voters who drive the effect, who pull the deservingness very low. So what you see is an average that is significant, but left-wing people don't apply this penalty. And this is something also would be interesting to study further. And the complementarity between SI and SC, social investment and social consumption, I totally agree on a policy level, but here we really wanted to see if there is a difference there. And then Stefano, so yes, I mean, I think what you pointed out is the fact that what Heusermann, Pallier, and Geretsman came up with, it's not so novel, because the ethos, the kind of philosophy that is behind their three models is very similar to the original welfare state. So you say a vision of the liberal welfare state explains perfectly what we observed, and you're right. Maybe what is interesting in their contribution, I think, is mostly the second one, so the stratified. This is maybe a bit different, even though there too, Asping Andersen told us the reproduction of status in the conservative welfare state, so stratifying is very similar. But maybe also what is interesting here is the fact that we thought maybe that as countries are moving towards this social investment paradigm, that this would mean the kind of disappearance, or at least this reduction of differences across welfare regimes. And they tell us maybe not, because social investment, everybody is doing social investment, but they're doing it differently. And so it may be the case that this is the contribution. It's not so much to have uncovered a different logic. No, the logic is very much similar to the original logic of the families of welfare state, but the contribution is more to say that even with social investment, we see a kind of a reproduction of divergence. Marcello? Yeah. 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 Reproduction, yes, yeah, of the traditional models, yes. And to Emanuele's points, yes, I think there are differences between these policies, more life course for childcare, and I don't know, I mean, the puzzle, I think there are many puzzles that remain unanswered, but one is why do we find institutional effects for childcare only and not for the employment-related policies? And for me, this is not so clear. I don't, maybe this character that you identify, maybe the fact that it's more recent childcare policy as a mass policy. Of course, childcare centers have existed for a longer time, but it's developed as a mass policy is more recent. So, but still, it's not so clear why we don't find an effect in unemployment insurance, which is quite different. I mean, in the UK, unemployment insurance is quite different from Switzerland and Germany. So this remains a bit of a puzzle, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, that's possible, yeah. So the degree of universality of the policy, basically, yes, yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, and of course the risk that, you know, the risk, yes, is, yes, this could be an explanation. Yeah, that could be an explanation. I think I'm done.
Thank you. I think we can conclude here. Again, thank you very much indeed. And we can conclude here. Thank you. Thanks.